Hey guys, welcome back. This will be a longer video. We are in chapter 8, The Little Wanderers. This is the end of part 1 of this book. This is going to be a very heavy chapter. Like I said, it's a little bit longer. It has a little bit more information. I want you guys to take self-care. If you need to pause, go ahead and pause. I get it. This whole book is very heavy, a very, very heavy topic that we are discussing here. But let's just jump right in. Okay. Boss Crump was so helpful to Georgia that I initially considered her manipulation of him to have been her greatest coup. Instead, I discovered her primary achievement to have been something I hadn't considered necessary: the creation of an adoptive market. When Georgia began her child placing career, almost no one adopted children. So I want to make it clear, from my understanding, there were still adoptions. It may not have been as popularized. There wasn't. How do I explain it? As we're digging into the history of child welfare, there were adoptions, right? Adoption, as far as we can see, the earliest adoptive laws were in place in 1851 in Massachusetts. That's not to say that adoptions didn't take place prior to that, but typically when we see adoptions prior to 1851, at least, from documentation, it is more out of necessity, due to wars and plagues. And so usually these children would go to kin, right? So kinship placement with other family members. There were placements that were more like indentured servitude, as we will be hearing as I talk about colonial times and child welfare during that. But there were other means of child welfare, right? It just wasn't the way that we look at adoption like current times, if that makes sense. So the legal process and the industry that we now know it was not quite the same as the way that Georgia created it. Now, I do also want to mention that there were presidents prior to Georgia, like Andrew Jackson, who, did a lot of harm with the Trail of Tears, who did take Lycona, right, and quote-unquote adopted him, basically kidnapped him. So again, there are stories of adoptees from prior to Georgia's time. It just there wasn't so much the buying and selling of children, especially for infertile means. Now, that's not to say that there weren't adoptions for infertility. There absolutely were. One of the earliest cases I have thus found, at least in the United States, was Sir Governor William Phips and his wife, Lady Phips, in Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials, adopted Spencer. It was a kinship placement, so Spencer was Lady Phips' nephew, and they did take him in. Now, I do not know as of yet, as I'm reading this, or as I'm talking to you guys, in terms of why they took him in, but one of the reasons that we have heard through my research is that Lady Phips was not able to have children of her own. She was having fertility issues. Does that also mean that, Spencer's biological parents weren't dealing with issues? I don't know yet, right? So I do want to make that clear that there could have been other reasons, but it is one of, and I say one of, the earliest records in the United States. Well, the United States wasn't the United States in colonial times, that I have found. Again, this was in the 1960s, I want to say 1960s, 1970s, maybe even a little bit after it. I know Salem witch trials was 1692 to 1693. So, yeah. It's around that time, maybe early 1700s. I will correct myself when I do that video, but just so you guys fully understand what I am talking about, that there have been other forms of quote-unquote adoption, right? And in Spencer's case, his last name did change, but only with Spencer's permission from what we have discovered, and it was much later in his placement, and that he has talked about himself. Spencer Phipps also became governor in Massachusetts, in Salem, or in Boston, right? And he later talks about, him wanting to take his adoptive father's last name. So for the longest time, he didn't have his last name, or his adoptive father's last name. And that is something that is a topic in itself. Names, we've sort of talked about it before, but it's definitely a heavier topic that we should be bringing up. Now, I do want to make mention that Georgia, when we're going to talk about her, we also have to remember that she told these biological parents, the birth mothers, that their children died. She also told the adoptive parents that the birth mother died giving birth, right? And so this is how we have fake birth certificates, because she forged them. She didn't put biological parents on the birth certificate. She put the adoptive parents, right? Or, it would be blacked out by law and sealed. And this is some of the same issues that we are dealing with now. Now, this can cause long-term trauma, and I'm going to say this. I am also doing another research on a fellow adoptee who was born much later, but I am doing a research on Son of Sam. I wouldn't say his adoptive story is dark, per se, but there's definitely trauma involved. Besides maternal separation, the things that his adoptive parents had told him, and I don't think that they meant to do harm, but it definitely caused a lot of trauma, and stuff that he will explain in his interviews, of how it affected his life, right? Things like he thought he killed his birth mother during his birth, and so all of this can create trauma. Again, I'm probably going to do a 2-part documentary on that, on him specifically, just because there's a lot to go through. But I definitely want to get into more of those heavier topics and history and psychology, because this is stuff that we do need to be talking about in terms of adoption, right? It's not just our individual stories. It's not just the laws, which, yes, play a huge role, but what effects does it have on us, right? What can we do to change it? What resources, right? That's my whole point. Adoptee healing and resources. What resources can we bring to adoptees to do better, right? I personally don't think we're ever going to be able to wipe out adoption, at least the way it is, right? At least here in America. It's going to take a lot of reform. It's going to take a lot of years. I mean, there's stuff in the works, don't get me wrong, but do I think it's all going to happen in my lifetime? No. But can we bring in more resources? Absolutely, right? That's why we talk about finding a therapist, someone that's adoption competent. That's why we talk about therapy for adoptive parents. If you're going through infertility, seek an infertility therapist. Infertility is seen as a disability. That's not an excuse, right? But also that shouldn't be placed on the child. I also don't think, right, that just because you are not able to biologically have your own child, that you should then go seek someone else's child, right? You are not owed a child. And that is a huge part of adoption market, is they aim their, oh, but you can just adopt, right? You don't have to have a biological child. Same thing with IVF, right? Where they aim the marketing tools towards those dealing with fertility issues, right? And so, like, I want to make it clear, it's not just the whole of society, it's marketing from these companies that are targeting them. And then with us as baby products, right? The supply and demand, we're the supply. They target impoverished families, single parents, especially those that are of different races that are non-white, although white people are targeted too. But typically it's more class-based. To give up your child for adoption, you're not going to be able to be good enough of a parent. You're not going to be able to ever provide for them. That these people that are much wealthier will do a much better job. And this is exactly what Georgia Tann was doing, right? We've heard this in an earlier chapter. That was exactly Georgia Tann's mindset. And we know now, I think a lot of us always knew, but we know especially now that you're not going to get the daddy warbucks, right? It's not like Annie, where we're in orphanages and like the rich man comes and we're all going to be rescued by a wonderful person. Like, that is a fantasy, right? And just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you can't be abusive, can't be, doing drugs or high, alcoholics or etc., right? We know that quite often happens. So just because you're in a wealthier position doesn't mean that you are a better parent, right? And I also want to note that oftentimes the adoptive parents are not much better off than the biological parents, and it only takes a fairly small amount, right? I think it's on average, from what I heard, $2,500 to keep a family together. Long term, right? And let me just say, I don't negate that traumas can't happen in biological families, okay? Like, let me be clear on that. If you are going to put that in my comments, we know that we're not advocating for unsafe homes, okay? Any child that is in an unsafe situation, it needs to be resolved. Now, during COVID, I'm going to specify during COVID-19, in 2020 and 2021, we saw a decrease in adoptions with the increase of money coming in. Now, I know a lot of people lost their jobs, but when we had government assistance with the stimulus checks, people felt like they were able to preserve their families. And we also see this, okay, this is you can literally look up the graph, that not only do adoptions decrease, but abortions, because I know a lot of people, not everyone, will be like, well, the opposite of adoption is they think it's abortion, which it's not, making that clear. Abortion is the end of a pregnancy. Adoption is the difference in parenting, okay? Very different. But a lot of these, especially Christian communities, think that if we end abortions, right, and the right to abortion, that they can all just adopt the children, right? Which they won't, first of all. Let's start with that. Second of all, those that do tend to do a lot more harm. They advocate for families to not be preserved. And when we talk about, when I've discussed this, when we have Democratic presidents, and again, I talked about this in my last video, that doesn't mean that all Democrats are good, okay? Or the whole of the party. But when we have Democratic presidents in, we have more help with Medicaid and other programs, right? And we see a decrease, like I was trying to say, sorry, long-winded, we see a decrease in both adoptions and abortion. Now, you would think, right, you would think that when I say this stuff, they'd be like, oh, that's great. No, because it's a Democrat, they don't care. They still want to get rid of, free lunches and breakfast in schools. They, want to decrease the Medicaid and all of that until it personally affects them. Like, they just don't care, right? It's pull yourself up by your bootstraps until they actually need the help. It just doesn't make sense. It could literally not affect me, and I just want people to be in a better position. That's the difference. For many of us, I should say. But that is the point, is that, like, a lot of these same individuals think the same ways that Georgia Tann did back then, right? They think that, a Daddy Warbucks or someone of a wealthier means is going to be able to take a child in and be a better parent, right? Instead of giving the resources to preserve families, right? There's also a component to adoption with, sometimes it has to do with race, but sometimes it's more to do with religion, where they adopt and then they force labor, like on farms. I was talking about to my therapist about this a couple weeks ago, where many adoptees who end up on farms end up going through a lot more complex trauma because they're worked, right? And this is the same thing with the orphan trains. It's a history of this. Now, I am blessed to have lived on a farm where my parents and my uncle and my aunt never forced my chores, okay? Yes, I had barn chores. I absolutely loved it. I begged for it. I begged for more. But it was never to the point where I was breaking down crying from pain, or in the hot sun, like over baking, no water, that kind of thing. Like, never maltreatment. But unfortunately, many people still do, right? And oftentimes when I see these bigger families that where majority of the kids are adopted, if not all of them, they're usually living a farm life. No, I'm not saying that everyone I know has adopted a lot of kids and they're all Christian and stuff. I know plenty of large families that have biological kids that, large and stuff. Again, not saying all of that. I'm just saying in terms of social media, people that we see where they're talking about their large adoptive families, there is a lot of harm. I kind of want to go into these families at some point, but I also kind of don't, because I don't want to traumatize the children, and it is their story. So I have mixed feelings, and I'm still deciding on all of that. I also don't believe that children's faces and stories should be put on the internet. So if I do anything, I'd have to be very, very careful to continue to keep my morals in check with my editing. Of course, you guys know I don't show my face, but I don't want to do that to other people, and I really want to use the children's own words. But I also feel like that's a compromising position for the child to talk about, and feeling like they're forced to do this to make money for their parents. And then we have cases like Natalia Grace and Micah Stauffer. Natalia Grace was readopted 3 times. She has, she's an adult and she tells her own story. We can definitely go over that. Micah Stauffer was an adoptive parent who rehomed her child Huxley, right? I think that was his name. And then she was thinking of adopting again. So I do want to make note that those situations still happen. They're just not talked about nearly enough. Again, that is not my experience, but there are adoptees who do talk about it. So when we get to that, I do want to kind of lead you guys in the right direction with citations and who to look at and who to who to watch and stuff, because I think that's really important, not just to hear from my voice but from other adoptees, because again, my story is just my story. There are other people who have vastly different experiences and opinions, and that's okay. We're not a monolith. Okay, so continuing on, because I just went off way on tangent for one paragraph. Let's continue on. I was more surprised by this fact than I should have been. I'd written several articles about adoption. My pieces, however, had concerned the institution as it existed in the 1990s, when the demand for healthy white American infants exceeded the supply. I had assumed that the number of adoptions in the first third of the 20th century had been proportionally consistent with the number arranged during the final third, when the U.S. population included 6 million adoptees. I had been naive, or if I'd had an intimation of the truth, afraid to face it. My analysis of Georgia's physical setting had been performed at little emotional cost, placing her within the context of the history of the care of homeless children would, I feared, be more difficult. It would, in fact, bring me uncomfortably close to Georgia and cause me to question how heinous she was. Sitting in the Cleveland Public Library one dark February day, I read facts so appalling they made her crimes seem almost benign. Yikes. That's scary. Knowing what I know about Georgia, whew, that is scary. It was an unwelcome thought, not only because I was more comfortable considering the outcome of her actions to have been absolutely pernicious, but because of what it implied about the suffering endured throughout the years of the most vulnerable among us. Over the next week, I realized that more than defensiveness had impelled an elderly Hickory woman to say, "We thought Georgia was doing a wonderful thing for the children." I recalled a Memphian boast that she hadn't given her children to garbage men. Poised at a road I didn't want to travel, I nervously considered to whom she had, directly or indirectly, provided babies. All right. The lives of unwanted children, always bleak, were revealed to have evolved from an even more laminate state as I researched further back in history to a point where babies were routinely unalived at birth by their parents. Infanticide was practiced and condoned in ancient Greece, endorsed by Aristotle and Plato. Okay, so I want to pause there. We will eventually get to that. There are still countries that do this. A lot of, I think it was China, right? The Chinese did this for a long time, right? We kind of like a known unfortunate history where if it was a little girl, they would, this was before international adoption to the U.S. specifically, they would try to unalive the baby, right? Because boys were seen as better. Or if the child was sick or deformed in any way, they would do the same thing. I was told by my own adoptive mother that Orthodox Jewish community did that as well, for the longest time before they would adopt out. Now, I found that interesting because I hadn't heard that. I want to fact check that she's Jewish, but I'm not saying that she's not right. I just hadn't heard that. Especially because I know that a lot of Jewish people adopt into their families. Now, I only know that because, one, she is Jewish and she adopted. I know several other Jewish families that have adopted, including my cousin. And then also, like, it's, yeah, I mean, there's different sects of Judaism, so I want to make that clear. But there are Jewish adoption agencies. There are also Muslim agencies. I want to make that clear. Okay, it's not the only religion that we'll talk about. I talked a little bit about Christianity and stuff. But again, some of this stuff still happens. Does that make it right? Of course not. So, it just sucks. There's always going to be really, really dark history, and I think we have to be prepared for that, and how we can do better. Now, I do want to say that in terms of China, they had changed, right, to, not only had they changed the one-child policy at one point, which is why it was specifically girls that they were trying to unalive, and then later adopt out to the U.S., or to other countries. But they had recently, right, we're now in 2025, but it was pretty recently that they apologized for the one-child policy and realized how much harm that did to not only Chinese families, but the impact it had on the adoptees. South Korea is also dealing with something similar. Now, as far as I know, there was no one-child policy. However, there was adoption, and there are a lot of birth mothers suing the government because of the harm that the government did in taking their children and adopting them specifically out to other countries. Ireland just apologized. Australia had made huge changes a while back. There are countries that don't even have what we call quote unquote adoption. They call it something else, but it's more of the kinship. The legal process is completely different, and they don't deny the child's family history. I'm thinking of really like Muslim-based countries like Qatar, Dubai. I know that I think there's still orphanages there, but when they quote unquote adopt within their country, they keep the child's name and history and stuff. I'm gonna have to dive deeper into all that, but I do want to make that clear. In terms of Australia, going back to Australia, what they did was, and now they have what we would consider they have 3 adoptions per year to strangers, is first they work on reunification. That should always be the first goal. Then they do kinship. If that isn't possible, then they'll do fictive kin, so someone like a family friend or someone within the same culture. And then I don't think that they do guardianship. I'm pretty sure they don't. And that's when they do the adoption to strangers. But it's still like it averages out to about 3 a year. So it's really not that bad in comparison to other countries. Now, a lot of countries have stopped international adoption to the United States, which is great. That's a step in the right direction. They still have adoptions. They still have adoptions to other countries, but it's not to the same extent. So we're making progress. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to laugh because it's dark, but we have made progress, okay? All right, continuing on. Some sickly, disabled, or female infants were suffocated, drowned, or dashed against rocks. More often, unwanted children were exposed, abandoned in marketplace or on hillsides. Most died of starvation. Others were forced into slavery or maimed for exhibition. Okay, so she's saying they're unwanted. I want to make it clear, we don't actually know if they're unwanted. I have a suspicion, and again, this is just a suspicion based off not only being a woman, but being a mother, and looking at the research of everything. That's not to say that unwanted children don't exist, but the rate of going through an entire pregnancy to just not want your child is ridiculous. I think in part it was societal norms and being forced, that they had no choice, and that they weren't allowed to talk about the treatment and how they felt. And this is kind of the same thing that we dealt with when talking about birth mothers who went to homes like Georgia Tan's, when we read The Home for Unwanted, the Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler, where birth moms were talking about the same, like, we wanted our children, like, we just didn't, it was just a bad time, we didn't have the resources, both financially and emotionally, we weren't allowed to talk about it. And so, like, even though we have documented history from ancient Greece, you also have to remember how women were treated, right? Even back then, women weren't highly educated, if educated at all. So we have to remember that a lot of these records were written by men, and we don't get full accounts of everything because of that. So I just want you guys to consider all of that when we are discussing that. Okay, continuing on. Infanticide gradually became less acceptable by the Middle Ages. Europeans who killed their children were subject to death by decapitation, impalement, or torture with glowing tongs. Ew. Some infanticidal women were burned as witches. Others were enclosed in sacks full of vipers and drowned in sacking ponds, like in Sacklach in Zittau, Germany. I don't know if I said that right. Okay, I'm gonna pause. Let me just say, we're about a week out from, I had just been to Salem. Like I told you guys, I'm doing a documentary on colonial child welfare. Again, I'm trying to still figure out how I'm going to do this video, but there is a museum there called the Salem Torture Museum. Now, it is $15 for a person, and I want to say it kind of wasn't worth it. It took like maybe 10 minutes for us to go through. But supposedly all of the stuff in the museum were all used on actual people. So when they're talking about these things, a lot of this was used on women, right? Mostly women were the ones that were being tortured. Not all of them, like, I want to make that clear. It wasn't all about, those that were accused of witchcraft. At this museum, there was things from Germany, there was things from other countries too. So want to make that clear, okay? Want to make that clear. But how people were treated throughout history, the torture is just sad and disgusting. And when I think about these parents, right, being put to death because a child died, right, I'm going to assume, okay, I'm not trying to make an ass out of myself, but I'm going to assume that it wasn't their first child, right? They likely had other children. So now you're leaving the children without a parent or both parents. That's not helping the situation. Now, that's not to say that the person doesn't deserve punishment by any means. I just don't think that they should die or be tortured. My personal opinion. Also, we have to remember, again, during this time, there was a lot of death for young children because of SIDS, because of diseases. There wasn't medicine like we have now. A lot of people lived rurally, or if they were in cities, it was easy for, like, plagues to spread. War was very common as well. So I guess my question would be for her, I mean, I guess I would have to look it up. But if a historian is listening to this, my question would be, when they are doing these types of things, are they only going after those that have been proved that they actually unalive their child and not due to any one of these other circumstances, right? Excuse me. Because you also have to remember that being starving to death, right? I'm not talking about being forced to starve to death because, you're placed outside and nobody was there to help you. But if you are, all right, excuse me, we're going to Black history for a moment. There were Black women who were mammies, right? That's what they were called. And they would breastfeed their master's child, and then they would have no supply for their own biological children, and therefore the biological children would starve and likely die, right? So think about that too, right? Or they'd have to supplement with other things which could cause other harms. Yeah. Okay. Continuing on. But poverty was so pervasive and contraceptive methods so ineffective that the killing of children continued. According to Rachel Zinneber Foreman, author of Let Us Now Praise Obscure Women, a study of single mothers in the United States and Britain, infanticide was the most common crime in Western Europe between the Middle Ages and the 18th century. Along with the practice, however, evolved more compassionate means of treating orphaned or unwanted children. An orphan asylum was built in what is now Trier, Germany in the 6th century. The first orphanage in our country was established by Ursuline nuns in 1727. But such institutions were rare. People were reluctant to support homeless children financially, and in Europe and the United States, even young single parents were legally obligated to raise their babies. Bastardy acts, including legislation passed in 1741 in North Carolina, which included what became the state of Tennessee, authorized imprisonment for any parent failing to support a child born outside of marriage. Several states passed laws forbidding separation of infants younger than 6 months from their mothers. Matrons of maternity homes forced residents to breastfeed their babies so the mothers would bond with them and keep them. Okay. Sorry, guys. She's not totally wrong on that from what I found in my research. When I was researching child welfare in colonial times, right, from what I found thus far, is that if there was a quote-unquote bastard child, right, an illegitimate child, a child born out of wedlock, they would try to find the biological father by means of the mother, right, and force the father to basically pay child support to help support the mother and the baby. Even during the Salem witch trials, there were young children imprisoned with their mothers, right? So an example is Sarah Good with her infant daughter and her daughter Dorothy Good, who was also accused at the young age of 4. Unfortunately, the infant died in prison, but they didn't want to separate the baby from the mother because she was so young. There was also Elizabeth Putnam. She was pregnant with, I think, John Putnam's 16th child or something like that. This is his 3rd wife, so I want to make that clear. While he was executed, she was spared because she was pregnant. So oftentimes, even then, there was a lot of remarriages, and there were a lot of step-parent adoptees, during this time because they wanted to continue to support families. So also making that clear, step-parent adoptees are very valid. Although it's slightly different from private infant adoption, there is a lot of history with it, and they are part of our community. They may have some understanding of what we go through, but not always, so want to make that clear. Okay. There's also acts prior to 1851, which I talked about was the first adoption on record in Boston, that those that were impoverished were sent to, oh God, I can't remember what it's called. It was next to the jail, but it wasn't quite the jail. So they were put there for a time with their children to, it's kind of like an asylum, right? Where they would be fed and clothed and housed. They would also maybe do indentured servitude, where they would have a family say, hey, I'll take this person. They'll come live with me, but they'll pay it off through work. And so in the case of Dorothy Good, right, she later went on to live with Benjamin and Nathaniel Putnam. Yes, they are related to John and Elizabeth, but that's a whole different story. One of them took her daughter, later Dorothy Good Jr., and indentured her for 18 years. So at the birth of this child, right, they said when she's old enough, she's going to start work. She was quite young, right? And we're going to put her to work, and she's going to work it off for 18 years. When Dorothy Good had her son, William, it was, I believe, the Bletchers. I think that's what their name was. Or Bletcher's son, something like that. Again, I'm going to do a whole video on this, where they took her son and indentured him for 21 years. So you see a little bit of a difference. And that is who will pay off all of the debts by working. So there are different types of child welfare. It just wasn't like, oh, hey, we're going to put them in an insane asylum or like an orphanage. I also want to note that, like I was saying prior, there were a lot of children orphaned because of things like the Black Plague, yellow fever, the French Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, eventually the Civil War. You guys get the point, right? So there were wars happening besides illnesses where children lost their parents, and so they would then go to a family member to live. So I want to make that clear as well. That's just for the colonists that I have found. But I can only imagine it was similar to what different tribal nations did as well. That it was someone, either a family member or, someone within the tribe that would take in the child. But I'd have to really dive deep into the individual tribes. Which, could totally be a topic for the future, but we got a lot of other things going right now. Anyway, I just went off on a tangent. Where were we? Okay. Orphans and foundlings were forced to earn their keep by working as servants or slaves. So like I said, indentured servitude. With trepidation, I read of the auction of 17 homeless children in Newton, Massachusetts in 1793. Having 5 minutes earlier learned of the murder of an orphan 12-year-old Boston servant in 1655. Bruises covered the boy's body. His back had been ripped open by lashes. His master was found guilty of manslaughter, but the sentence only to being burned on the hand. There was no mention in any of the books of what became of the 17 auctioned Newton, Massachusetts children. Man, that's heavy. Infanticide institutionalization, auctioning these and other methods of caring for unwanted children overlapped in time and coexist today in some countries. But there has also been some progress with relatively fewer child deaths and more humane care of orphans. Okay, so I do want to say there is a higher number of child deaths within the adoptees being unalived than biological children. Again, that's not to say biological children don't die at the hands of their biological parents, but if you compare the two, the adoptees are at a highest rate. Step-parent adoptees, so I should say private infant adoptees and foster youth are at one rate. Step-parent adoptees are another rate, so not quite as high, but still very concerning with the risks. And then the biological children. Okay, so yes, there's fewer, but it still should be alarming. The issue is that when we talk about this in terms of adoptees bringing up these statistics and these risks, people usually bring up, what about the bio kids? You know, what about these? It's like, you guys are acting as if we're saying that they belong in unsafe homes, which is totally not the case. We're saying that majority of the time, adoptions are not necessary, right? Majority of the time. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and we have to remember that. There are going to be times where a child should be removed, but what should be the process in these cases, right? What should be the checklist of not only resources to help preserve families, but also if and when these situations happen. Because of government, we remove far too many kids that actually should have stayed in their homes, and those that stayed get overlooked and then get unalived, right? Both in biological and in adoptive homes, and that is quite concerning. So just throwing that out there. And again, also towards the word orphans, right? People, the actual definition of orphan is the loss of both biological parents. And so this is what's frustrating, is there are plenty of children that are put into orphanages who still have not only a living biological mother and or father, who just couldn't care for their child and needed help, but they also have other living relatives. And we don't know the situation of why the child was necessarily placed in an orphanage. It just doesn't necessarily make them an orphan by definition. In that definition. Does that make sense? Like, they're a child that needs care. They're just not necessarily an orphan. Okay. Another means of caring for children was indentured, which originated in England. Indentured children worked for host families in exchange for lodging and food. So what I was talking about with Dorothy Good Jr. and William Good. While the hosts weren't expected to treat the children as family, they were required to educate them and provide them with several acres of land at the end of their servitude at 21. But provisions of the benefits was not enforced. Few children received an education or any land, and many were abused. Indentured children were considered nuisances, and the British deported many of them to their colonies. So if they weren't already indentured in the colonies, that's where they would be sent. 4 indentured youngsters traveled on the Mayflower in 1620. Life in the New World, arduous at best, was particularly difficult for indentured overworked indentured children. Only one of the Mayflower orphans survived his first Plymouth winter. Remember, they weren't prepared for how cold it was. A lot of people died. I think it was like 50%. Concern regarding the high mortality rate suffered by these children was outweighed by desire to keep them off the public dole. Indenturing was popular, and with the limited use of institutionalization, contained the problem of homeless children for a time. I'm going to find out who this child was that was on the Mayflower. I do want to make note that, as I've also been talking about colonialism, I've been doing my own ancestry, and on my biological father's side, I think my biological mother's father's side. Oh my god. Now I'm trying to like think of it. It's my biological father, his mother, her mother. And you keep going up that way, somewhere up in there. Not only did I find people like Thomas, why can't I think of his name? It was Thomas and John. Now I'm blinking out. Proctor. Sorry. Right? I think it was it Proctor? No, it wasn't Proctor. Hold on a second. Okay, so I just looked at the family tree. It was Thomas and John Rogers, who were both on the list of on the Mayflower. Thomas was the father, John was his son. They were the first two to come over. And then later other family members. I do have Proctors somewhere up in that family line close to them. But no, they're not the same Proctors that were related to the Salem witch trials, which I thought was interesting. I also have John Smith, there's actually 3 John Smiths, which is crazy. Not the first time in my family where we have the same person, name after name after name, father, son, grandson. But no, it is not the same John Smith, despite living in Virginia around the same time that the John Smith that we know of with Matoaka had come over. So I do want to clear that up. No, I am not related to that John Smith at all. Supposedly he never had married or had kids, which is fine because, he raped a 13-year-old. Matoaka was 13, and so was Matoaka was forced to marry John Rolfe, and forced back to England, and she is one of the most well-known MMIWs, right? Missing Indigenous women, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I do want to clear that up. So that is up somewhere up in my tree anyway. Some people are very lucky to be able to trace their ancestry. Some people are not. I have been looking for records of other adoptees, like well-known, famous adoptees, like in history. I have yet to find all that much. I have a list, but like, I'm still digging, okay? Still digging. Anyway, I also find it, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. I also found it interesting as I'm doing my research in my family tree that on my biological side, it actually took me a very long time to get this far, so I'm going to make that clear. And I had to buy the worldwide version of Ancestry for the month just to be able to go through records, because I went through all the free ones that I could. So I've done that, and on my adoptive parent side, my mother's side has been done for a long time. I've kind of talked about this, it was one of my cousins who happens to be the other adoptee in my family. He and I and our grandmother all worked on it together. That's how we got really close. Like, all 3 of us just worked on it, which was really fun. But we were able to get quite far on that side. However, on my adoptive father's side, I'm stuck despite having the worldwide thing. Like, I can't go past a certain point, which is so weird when, and I only say this because I'm gonna bring up religion again for a moment, because like I was saying, my mother is Jewish, so you would think a lot of records got destroyed. My father's Christian. They both came from Europe. In like their families came from different parts of Europe around the same time, like late 1880s, early 1900s on that side. Whereas on my biological side, it goes way, way further, as we can tell. Some to colonial times, some a little bit after, some were indigenous. That side, I'm having difficulty until I am able to get to the reservation to really dig deep, unless they are willing to put out the records to Ancestry, which would be lovely, but I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting depending on where you're from, right? And this goes to search and reunion. Like, how are you able to find your family? How are you able to get records, especially as an adoptee? Because unfortunately, a lot of states still have laws where you cannot access your information. Anyway, sorry, I keep going off on tangent. Continuing on, I'll try not to go off on tangent as much the rest of this chapter because it's very long. But the Industrial Revolution in the 1880s and the influx of 35 million European immigrants to the United States swelled the ranks of the poor, some of whom were unable to care for their children. Many desperate mothers gave their babies to workers at foundling asylums. Lacking sufficient employees, however, workers at many orphanages boarded the babies with uneducated women who killed them with neglect. Abandoned children found by the police were usually dead. Those discovered alive in New York City were taken to Bellevue Hospital, where they were randomly assigned religions and names. An infant found in the alley would be named Charlie Alley. A girl found under a cherry tree would become Cherry Hill. Infants whose discovery coincided with a sensational murder trial were named after their victims, witnesses, or perpetrators. The abandoned children were cared for by prisoners, and if they survived until age 4, went to poorhouses. Okay, so first of all, if you don't know New York City, Bellevue Hospital, right behind it, I don't know if it was still part of Bellevue, but kind of where the coroner's office is, it used to be, up until like maybe the early 2000s, 2010s, was still a institutional, like an asylum sort of, well, not like a full asylum, but like there were definitely a lot of mental health patients there. So when I wasn't upstate New York, I was living in that area. So a lot of crazy things happened. And it's just, it's sad. Now, Bellevue has definitely changed. Back then, I had no great love for Bellevue. There were definitely concerns that I had, but I will say, since then, since the birth of my own child, I've been to Bellevue a couple times to the emergency room, and I will say I did have a good experience. So if you do have to take your child there and you're living in New York City, I definitely recommend it. I had a better experience at Bellevue over NYU. I will just say that. Even over Mount Sinai, what used to be Beth Israel, we still had a better experience at Bellevue, even for children. So, again, deep history, but yes. My experience with Bellevue, it kind of gives me a weird, icky feeling in terms of the institutionalization. Okay. Filthy institutions in which children in which children mixed with criminally insane adults. Poorhouses were condemned by reformers as living tombs. The subsequent building of more orphanages must have seemed like progress. But although some children's asylums were undoubtedly good, those I read about seemed little better than poorhouses, with infant mortality rates 50% on average, and in places such as New York City, Randall's Island, as high as 100%. Okay, if you know about Randall's Island, that's no surprise, okay? Randall's Island, again, has gotten better. It's now used, I think part of it is used as now for training for the police, if I remember correctly. But knowing the history of it, and knowing the history of Rikers Island, where the Rikers prison is, does not, again, surprise me. So, where were we? During the particular terrible year of 1895, 129 foundlings were admitted. One was adopted, 4 were reclaimed by their parents. Every one of them remaining, 124 babies died. The odds of child deaths couldn't have been higher than in this orphanage. But in terms of sheer cruelty, nothing equaled what occurred on baby farms. Baby farms were homes or apartments where all for a small fee, uneducated women housed babies whose parents were unable to raise them. Some baby farmers received periodic payments. Others were paid in a lump sum. Those receiving one-time fee had no financial incentive to keep the children alive, and some farmers starved, suffocated, or drowned them. Death rates on baby farms, whose owners had insured the lives of their charges, were particularly high, a fact that inspired an 1895 New York Times editorial urging that life insurance for children be declared invalid as it was a temptation to inhumane crimes. Nevertheless, the killing of children for insurance benefits continued. The sentences for farmers found guilty of exposing babies to the sun for so long their skin blackened and they died of dehydration, fatally poisoning children with whiskey or cracking their skulls against walls, were abysmally low. One baby farmer who killed at least 53 children received a 3 to 7 year sentence. That's it. She killed 53 children, and the max she would serve is 7 years. What the hell? Residents of poorhouses and baby farms who survived to adolescence often fled. It's difficult to know how many children, orphaned, abandoned, or having run away, were on their own by 1872. The number of street urchins were estimated to be 30,000 in New York City and 6,000 in Boston. These and other cities teemed with the young homeless who begged, stole, sold newspapers, and sometimes prostituted themselves for food. They were the quote-unquote apple boys and the quote-unquote flower girls who peddled their goods on street corners, the quote-unquote singing girls who boarded dock ships at night to entertain the men with music, were sometimes raped, and the true-life counterparts of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl, which I had never been able to read as a child without crying. Oh. If you guys watch, there is a Disney short based off that book called The Little Match Girl, and it is so incredibly sad. Even the Disney version is quite sad in how this sweet little girl was treated because she was a young orphan. Reading now of where these children slept, on steps in filthy cellars, the iron tubes of bridges in Harlem, and burned out safes on Wall Street, of how 10 would pile together for warmth in winter or jostle for spots near grates through which hot air blew, generated by underground presses. I felt like crying again, and simply not for these now long dead waifs. What I had been avoiding was gaining on me. I kept putting a particular face to that singing girl, and a name. I drove home from the library that evening through streets full of salt-encrusted vehicles and gray with slush. Viewed after reading of baby farms and rat-infested tenements, my home seemed more luxurious than I usually found it. It was located in the comfortable kind of suburb I had once vowed I would never live in, and that I appreciated then for its safety and for good public school. Even families so sheltered, of course, have problems, and mine had its share. But not that night, when all was perfect, with a fire in the fireplace, my husband having arrived home unexpectedly early from a business trip, warming sauce and cooking pasta, the children working on and occasionally helping each other with algebra and geometry problems. I tried not to think about my luck. I feared I'd jinx it, and I didn't tell my family what threatened me and how it might affect us. I did explain that homeless children had been so poorly valued in the past that the name of the Nashville orphanage, the Home for Friendless Children, had elicited no protest, and that even social reformers of the 19th century had called the children ragamuffins, little wanderers, street Arabs, and gutter snipes. Wow. This is heavy. These terms hardly inspired people to want to raise these children. In the library the next afternoon, I was reminded that the institution of adoption, which throughout its history in the United States has been regulated by state-to-state basis, and which has existed legally in Massachusetts past the country's first adoption law in 1851, was not immediately popular. At the beginning of the 20th century, adoption was still rare. Unadoptable children were beginning to seem not more but less desirable because a belief in an ideology that, imported from England, insisted that they were genetically flawed. Oh, God. So I will say I hadn't done that much research on the law yet. It was just a quick glance. But it does not surprise me because of the way that we are still treated with our genetics. Someone was telling me last night that Mormons believe that if we're adopted into a Mormon family, our genes, they think that our DNA changes. I can't explain. I have no words. Like how, yeah. Talk about lack of science. But, I will say that as great as my adoptive parents are, there have been moments where my parents have said, you don't want to be as big as your birth mother, or, harmful things like that, right? Regarding my genetics. It's usually not that harmful, but that is one of the big triggers in my household anyway. So, and I know that others have gotten it, similar, if not worse, in terms of their genes, in terms of their adoptive parents talking about their genetics. But, yeah, we'll just keep it at that. Developed by Charles Darwin's second cousin, Francis Galton, the eugenics movement promoted the maintenance of a genetically healthy population by means that included sterilization of people deemed unfit to procreate, and was meant to counter the fact that poor, uneducated Americans were bearing more children than that were cultured ones. Some particularly prolific breeders were among those considered the most abnormal single mothers. The books and articles I read never explained why these mothers were considered abnormal. I I gather that the magnitude of their sin was considered sufficient proof. Their abnormality was supposedly manifest in their feeble-minded intellect, depraved morals, or physical abnormalities. The author of a 1918 study called, quote, The Unmarried Mother, a study of 500 cases, describes single mothers as repulsive and mishappen. A physician writing in the journal Mental Hygiene claimed that some mothers were excessively equipped sexually. Researchers found that they expected what they expected to see. The 1918 study of 500 unmarried mothers pronounced 1/3 R word. You can imagine what that means. And most of the rest, moral monstrosities, melancholic, demented, psychotic, or epileptic. What? Young women for whom no shred of evidence of illness could be found were labeled probable epileptics or pre-insane. Their babies, according to eugenicists, would inherit their worst traits. Not even idealists such as Reverend Charles Loring Brace believed that children could escape their inherent taint. It is well known to those familiar with the criminal classes, he wrote in his influential book, The Dangerous Classes of New York, published in 1872, that certain appetites or habits, if indulged abnormally and excessively through 2 or more generations, come to have an almost irresistible force and no doubt modify the brain so as to constitute almost an insane condition, referring to a 9 or 10-year-old given up apparently beyond control to licentious habits or desires, he warned. The gremmules or latent tendencies or forces or cells of her immediate ancestors were in her system and working in her blood and producing irresistible effects. These effects, he believed, would soon be felt by everyone. The title of Brace's book referred to the children of the poor, who he believed formed a dangerous underclass that, if unreclaimed, would poison all of society. These children were generally considered unworthy of adoption, but Brace and others felt that they could be prevented by destroying the nation by serving time in quote-unquote God's own country on farms in the Midwest. Brace, a Yale graduate from a prominent New England family, founded the New York Children's Aid Society in 1853. His organization and the New York Foundling Hospital, which was run by the Sisters of Charity, were responsible for the massive resettlement of the Eastern poor in American history, the Orphan Train Project. Brace and his workers swept through New York City streets, gathering up orphans and children of the poor and shipping them out west. Between 1853 and the early 1930s, approximately 250,000 children were quote-unquote resettled. Okay, I also want to note, not only did they go after the poor, they also went after black and brown children. So it wasn't just white children that they were targeting, it was also of different races. And part of that was because of the Civil War. He knew that he could benefit off of these young children being used as servants, right, shipping them Midwest into the South when slavery ended. So let's keep that in mind, okay? He did this. The orphan train resettlement differed from indentured in that custody of the children remained with Brace's organization and not with the farmers, who would expose them to the fresh air and farm work. That would affect their redemption. But like indentured, it depended on for its success upon the kindness of strangers. The scope of Brace's vision, combined with a lack of resources, precluded investigation of those who took in children and seldom allowed for supervisory visits. His methods were bare-boned, involving the deployment of scouts who traveled out west searching for areas in obvious need of free labor. Notices were posted such as wanted homes for children a company of homeless children from the East will arrive at Troy, Mississippi on Friday, February 25th, 1910. What happened next was seen differently by the different parties. Brace, who believed so strongly that children were benefited by resettlement, they couldn't understand why some poor parents refused to allow theirs to ride the train, described the process like this. On a given day in New York, the ragged and dirty little ones are gathered to a central office from the streets and lanes, are cleaned and dressed and sent away. Under the charge of an experienced agent, when they arrive in the village, a great public meeting is held. Farmers come in from 20 or 25 miles looking for the model boy who shall do the light work at the farm. Housekeepers look for girls to train up. Mechanics seek boys for their trades. Thus, in a few hours, the little colony is placed in comfortable homes. Orphan train riders found the journey much more complicated and frightening. Most were headed for states and towns they'd never heard of. Since the train made several stops at which a portion of the children were quote-unquote resettled, many were separated from siblings and friends. At the stops, the children were taken to a courthouse, church, or opera house and placed on an elevated platform. Signs identifying them by numbers were sometimes hung around their necks. Farmers examined the children's teeth and checked their muscles, then marked down the numbers of their first, second, or third choices. Some children were made to tell jokes or do acrobatic stunts. The children must have felt like slaves at an auction, and receiving this strange new environment, no indication of their worth other than audience reaction, experienced extreme humiliation if they weren't selected quickly. Robert Pedersen, an Omaha attorney who rode the train to Blair, Nebraska at age 6 in 1923, later recalled the terrible Saturday night when no one wanted him, and the happiness he experienced 2 days later when he was selected. He was doubly fortunate that the farming couple treated him not as a farmhand, but as a quasi-legal son. Few train riders were treated as sons and daughters. Interviewed in the 1980s by the authors of We Are Part of History, The Story of the Orphan Train, 93-year-old Mother Goth of Clinton, Missouri, recalled, "My experience was that of a servant. My foster mother was cruel. Oh, she was a crackerjack. As Mary matured and planned to leave to get a paying job, her foster parents schemed to have one of their sons impregnate her so she would remain their maid." God, so she was raped at the behest of her foster parents. That's disgusting. I also want to make note that during this time, the farmers not only treated them terribly, and a lot of children also died and buried who knows where. They would switch up from place to place. So if one farmer felt that the child wasn't doing well, another farmer may take them. And this Brace guy, right, the New York Home Society didn't necessarily know. They didn't keep track of them. And that is extremely problematic. So this is our history. This is what orphan trains looked like. It wasn't, we talk about child welfare and how kids were treated. This stuff still happens. I'm not saying that kids are shipped to, different places, but we still have families that are quote-unquote fostering or quote-unquote adopting and using the children for labor. Now, is it common? I would say, I would say it depends on the area. That's and let me reference this by saying that's not to say that children don't need chores or being in a structured place, right? Children do need that, but to come into a house to only work the farm, right? To not get the education, to not get the love and all that, to be overworked, like I was telling you guys at the beginning, that some people, were treated in the farm life, that's not okay, right? Some farm chores, like, okay, go help milk the cows, or go muck the barn, just don't keep the children in the heat. Don't have them, picking the corn, or, like the slaves were doing, during, indentured, or not during indentured, during chattel slavery, where you had, black people picking cotton, things like that. Like, no, like, that's not okay, right? Even if you're paying them, children should not be labor force. But we also have to remember, even when we have this attorney talking about how he got lucky that his foster parents treated him like a son, we are still kind of playing the role of a fantasy family, right? Where a lot of these families, even to this day, have, not everyone, but quite a few have fertility issues. Again, I understand that that's a disability, but we're treated in such a way that we are pretending to be a family. I say pretending, like, yes, it's legal on paper. We're a paper family, but not biological. That doesn't make it any less than, okay? So don't come at me. But my point still stands that we're playing into this role, right? That we're expected to act like our adoptive parents and live up to their expectations, and not be able to be as authentic to ourselves. So that's what I mean. Okay. Let's continue on. Where was I? The worst hardship suffered by orphan-trained children was the separation from their parents. One little girl who had been placed in a comfortable home wrote to an orphan-trained worker, "I would give 100 worlds like this if I could see my mother." So, maternal separation, right? Something that we talk about. Despite the pain of these children, Brace's experiment was considered a success, and there was little criticism to the fact that resettled train riders worked long hours in their country homes. Most poor children, even those who lived with their parents, labored at home or in the fields, and after the Industrial Revolution in factories. Employers bragged about the electric piecework produced by children's nimble fingers. Some Americans were shocked, however, to learn that these children were as young as 4. Reformers took note, and by 1900, 28 states passed legislation protecting child workers. The laws were vague and difficult to enforce, but combined with the passage of compulsory education legislation and steadily rising income levels, they obviated the need for children to supplement parents' income. Child labor began to seem wrong, even for orphans. With less emphasis placed on the earning potential, children began to be valued as children. They also seemed to be growing scarce. Between 1850 and 1915, the annual birth rate for native white children dropped nearly 40%, from 42.8 to 26.2 per thousand, with the average married couple producing 3 children, not the 8 they would have a century before. Some contemporary accounts attributed the decrease to fertility to tight corseting. The apparent shortage of children made each one seem more precarious. The stigma regarding adoption persisted, however, fed not only by tales of the bad gremmules, but by the skepticism of social workers who insisted that the orphans be studied for a year before adoption to ensure their fitness for placement. Many adults strongly desired to parent. However, there had always been some willing to raise children born to others. While some procured children through orphanages, others obtained babies through secretive means. The earliest such instance of which I read involved a childless elderly knight named Thomas of Salby and his elderly wife, who lived in Lincolnshire, England, in the 17th century. Anxious to have an heir and aware of the impossibility of adopting in England, and which, because of a belief of the importance of maintaining bloodlines, didn't have adoption legislation until 1926. They obtained a baby girl from a village woman, and Thomas's wife pretended to have borne her. The couple stood fast, keeping the baby even after their bishop threatened to excommunicate them for fraud. Thomas, who realized how much of his wife loved the child, is said to have told the bishop, "I fear the wrath of my wife more than I fear the wrath of God." That is kind of funny, but also not surprising. They say, happy wife, happy life, right? We also see more that adoptive mothers tend to be a little bit more narcissistic. I'm not saying all, please don't come at me with that, but oftentimes it's seen that like it's the wife, the mother, that wants a child so desperately she'll do anything, whereas the father would be okay if they were just childless, right? And it's just kind of to please their wife, right? Okay, continuing on. The subject of a February 1921 New York Times article went further than Thomas's wife. Over the previous 13 years, 51-year-old Mrs. F.E.A. south of Atlanta, Georgia, had not only secretly obtained 11 children, but fooled even her husband into thinking she'd borne them. They range in age from 2 months to 13 years, the reporter wrote, and live in complete ignorance of their true origin, although obviously not for much longer. Mrs. South had procured them secretly, continued the reporter, because of her quote-unquote great desire for babies, which explained why she had acquired them, but not why she lied about it. His readers wouldn't have needed that explained. In 1921, adoptable children were still considered taint, not simply by the public in general, but in many cases by the thousands of would-be adoptive mothers. There is no mention of the Times piece of whether Mr. South would have welcomed these 11 children into his home if he had known they weren't biologically his. When interviewed, he was apparently still in shock, insisting that his wife's confession was an infernal lie. Well, similarly, skirting the issue of American males' aversion to adoption, an article published in 1921 to Sunset, the Pacific Monthly, noted the increasingly frequency of women deceiving their mates. It is uncommon for a woman to call upon a maternity home worker, announce that she has informed her husband of the stork's impending visit, explain that the husband is on a business trip, and present a rush order for a child. Surprisingly often, the husbands were duped, but in 1926, Miss Nat Bass of Brooklyn, New York, felt compelled to confess her deception to her husband, and the district attorney, when the baby farmer from whom she had purchased an infant, was investigated for fatally starving and beating 22 children. Fearful the farmer would reveal her name, Mrs. Bass admitted to faking both a pregnancy and a minor traffic accident, which she had claimed necessitated she'd be treated at the baby farmer's clinic. When her husband arrived, she lay in bed with a newborn baby boy. Mrs. Bass believed that her husband would accept only a birth child and not an adopted baby. Seemed to have been accurate, for although authorities were willing to allow her to keep the 8-month-old Nat Jr., her husband rejected him. I don't want the child. I won't keep it in my home. I did love it because I loved it to be my own son. You'll have to take the child away. Notice how they say own? Like, you can tell, even with families, sometimes it's a slip up, but it's like the psychological point where, sorry guys, I got interrupted. So it's like the psychological effect when people talk about children, right? And I've seen videos, or I've heard people talking about children, and they'll be like, yeah, I have 3 children of my own. 2 are biological, one is one is adopted, 2 are of my own, right? And it's just, it's that own, like, God, what was I watching? I forgot what it was. It was a documentary on Netflix, and it was the biological family of the adoptive parents who the father unalived the child who was an adoptee, right? And it was his aunt or his sister or something. I can't remember exactly, but it was what that woman was saying, the aunt of this adopted girl. She was like, oh yeah, and when they finally had a baby of their own, like, it was like they became a family. And I'm like, wait, of their own? Like, why couldn't you just say they had a biological child later in life and they grew their family, right? Like, why is it, oh, they finally had a family? First of all, they were already a family when they're married. Second of all, they unfortunately grew their family through adoption. And then they grew the family even bigger when they had a biological child. And it's like, again, I don't think it was very intentional, but words matter, right? And it's like, we're not always accepted because we're adopted. And this is the same thing sometimes even with biological in Search and Reunion. I don't know if it was a comment or a video that I had seen on TikTok where someone was talking about their story, how they were searching for family, and they found the family, and they weren't accepted by the biological family because the father was the adoptee, didn't get to grow up with them, and how that impacted this person being related to. Excuse me. That's kind of how I felt with my bio family, right? My bio dad's side. When I called my grandmother, it's like I didn't exist because they didn't want me, right? That's not to say I wasn't wanted, because my birth mom wanted me, but it's just such an impact that, yeah, and how we're treated. So it really is just sucks, and I wish more adults would just be better and be more child informed and trauma informed and have more of an empathetic understanding, in my opinion. But can't force that on everyone, right? We can't expect that. Where were we? The baby became a public charge, which meant he could be sent to Randall's Island. The poor little thing, understated the prosecutor, got a very bad break in life. Reading this, I could almost literally see the split. See the thousands of children languishing in orphanages and on baby farms. The thousands of infertile adults who desperately wanted a child, but because of a belief in eugenics, were afraid to adopt one. Between them was the void I had sensed when reading the books on adoptive history, which noted that the number of adoptions had increased threefold between 1934 and 1944, but never mentioned why this had happened, or that in one southern city, the number of adoptive placements had spiked decades before that. As I researched the history of the care of homeless children, the void had grown progressively less empty. In it, summoned as if by some perversive part of my subconscious, was the woman forced to seek the prestige, money, and power she would never achieve in law in the unlikely venue of social work. led by a sense of opportunism and specific psychological urges to the subcategory of adoption. She developed both her business and the institution of adoption by doing something unprecedented, making homeless children acceptable, even irresistible to childless couples. She accomplished this by insisting, when most children placement workers were apologized for the unworthiness of adoptable babies, that there were neither children of sin nor genetically flawed. They are, she said repeatedly, blank slates. Now, people still believe that we're blank slates, but we are not. Okay? That is a whole different video, because, wow, we can get into that. But Georgia is saying that, like, we are born without any attachment, anything to our biological family, to our, our culture, our history, our birth parents, like, that we have no attachment to that, which is completely untrue. But that is the idea, right? That is why more people want babies instead of older children. So they're born untainted, and if you adopt them at an early age and surround them with beauty and culture, they will become anything you wish them to be. So basically molding us, right? Georgia didn't actually believe the children were blank slates, but she made her sales pitch with conviction, evising the bravado that would later allow her to decry black market adoptions while arranging them herself. But she didn't rely on her ability to persuade, even as she proclaimed rearing and environment mean much more than inheritance. So she's talking about nature versus nurture, right? She falsified children's records, transforming them from the offspring of parents she considered poor white trash to the children of debutantes and medical students. She portrayed her children as more genetically perfect beings than most adoptive parents could have been born themselves, and Georgia virtually guaranteed the success of her placements. 100 of our children turn out, on average, much better than 100 children raised in their families of birth, she said. The reason is that ours is a selective process. We select the children and we select the home. People other than Georgia learned how to exploit the previously underground market for adoptable children, and baby farmers began selling children for as much as $100. Nationally, adoption remained rare in the 1920s. The orphan trains traveled west until the early 1930s, but by 1935, Georgia had waiting lists with the names of couples from across the United States, Canada, and South America. I sat hunched in the library reading room, recoiling from my discovery that Georgia Tann had invented modern American adoption. I was almost afraid to learn what her proximity to the institution said about it and her. Adoption, a respected institution that has brought millions of people joy. Again, when we're talking about joy, we're talking about the adoptive parents on that one. Reflected more flatly than I wanted to on Georgia, softening her edges, making haze of her essence. I was accustomed to thinking of her solely of hurting children, demeaned them, sold them, or even killed them. I was accustomed to focusing on those she stole, whose lost parents, siblings, histories, whose mothers lost not only babies, but their babies' babies, grandchildren, and on and on. Unimaginable, immeasurable, unquantifiable griefs, but an unknowable percentage of the more than 5,000 children Georgia sold had in fact lost their parents to death, relinquishment, or abandonment, and without her intervention might have well died on baby farms. This, for so many Memphians, and that February day, even for me, was the sticking point. She did help some children. She helped them admittedly for ignorable motives, and even when she helped them, she did it accidentally, since by requiring only that adoptive parents pay her fee and failing to investigate their characters, she never knew whether she was putting babies into cold or abusive situations. Some of her children, however, ended up with wonderful adoptive parents. Did the fact that she occasionally, uncaringly, inadvertently helped children exonerate her, even in part? I knew it didn't. But that day, I felt it did. I felt a chink in my defenses through which Georgia could wound me. Okay, I want to pause there. Barbara! My God! So first of all, we have to remember that this author is an adoptive parent. Okay, as great of a journalist is, and as deep into it as we know, she still has rose-colored glasses on. And even though she said herself, she knew that no matter what, even if there was like one family basically that was quote-unquote wonderful, which we don't actually know, we don't know how the adoptee fared. We also have to remember that through the laws / legal process of adoption, we as adoptees lose rights. We have trauma. Only the adoptee, I'm going to make this very clear, only the adoptee gets to determine if the adoptive parents are wonderful, okay? But even despite that, in all circumstances, I personally will never see it as successful when we lose human rights, okay? We can have instances where, yes, the adoptive parents are trauma-informed like mine are, where they fight to make changes, and that's great and stuff. But until we change the entire system, I will never see adoption as a whole as wonderful or successful or even necessary, right? Especially when we have other forms of safe external care. So hearing that there are wonderful adoptive parents, that, I can basically forgive Georgia because she accidentally may have done some good in placements, because these children may have ended up on baby farms, right? Now remember, we're talking about the treatment of poor and how poor were prosecuted throughout history, because why we have no empathy as a society, I don't understand. I'm going to look at this as she still has these rose-colored glasses on. Whereas if it were me, right, and I was in this situation where I had this money to help, I would instead create a system like Medicaid, right, helping these families get into better positions to keep their families, right? If you're going into social work, to help with the understanding of keeping families together and less trauma and things like that. Again, we're talking, I'm now in 2025, not, the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? But she could have done that. She could have. I think Georgia was always going to do harm. That's just my personal opinion. Because she could have literally placed children without raping them, molesting them, like mentioned in previous chapters, without kidnapping them, because there's enough children that needed a safe external care home to be in, right? She also had homes for quote-unquote unwanted mothers, right? Where these mothers were pregnant and giving birth. Instead of ripping these children away, help them get back on their feet, right? And there was such a way that she could help in that manner. She chose not to. I don't think that all of these children would have wound up on baby farms. I'm just going to be real for you guys. I don't think that baby farms would have necessarily been fully in existence, let alone to the same extent, had she done a lot of harm. Again, we're talking 2020 hindsight, okay? But for this author to write that paragraph, I am just frustrated. I'm exhausted by listening to adoptive parents and not listening to adoptive parents kind of like still be all up in their feels, and like she's talking about the joy of adoption again from the adoptive parent point of view, even though she's literally written in her book, right? Mothers lost their babies, children lost their families, their culture. She still has such a bias that's so ingrained in her, where she's like, oh, it's wonderful, that's okay. The fuck? This is sorry, I'm cursing. This is the same mindset, and I'm sorry, it is bullshit. This is the same mindset that was happening after Georgia Tann was found out to be human trafficking, where these adoptive parents didn't give a crap because they benefited, right? Where they said, oh, we're going to let this man, Robert Taylor, investigate but block him at every turn. But yet, in the same breath, create legislation to legitimize all of the adoptions that Georgia Tann had created, even though that they were illegal, because they didn't want to actually help. So I don't know if Barbara is listening on this, and as great as this information is, and of course we can't really get rid of our biases, so I'll give you that. But this is why it's super, super, super freaking important to listen to adoptees, because that paragraph alone is extremely harmful. Okay, continuing on. I was vulnerable to, on the other side of Georgia Tann's adoption equation. This side, I sense, was even more tainted by my proximity to her than she was shown to advantage by it. The reason was more than intellectual aversion to seeing a respected institution sullied. I am a person who often feels guilty for things not remotely my fault. Conversely, I sometimes feel even more accountability, grateful to people like Thomas Edison for inventing the light bulb. I am a person who would feel that adoptive parents are indebted to the person who popularized the institution from which they profited. And I didn't want to owe Georgia Tann anything, least of all my adopted child. See, so she kind of admits, right? She benefited. We have to remember she benefited from the system. You know who didn't benefit from the system? Her adopted child. You know who didn't benefit from the system? Me. All the other adoptees. Not really. Not when we lose human rights. Not when there are laws that literally treat us as other people, right? We've always been a marginalized community. Now, don't get me wrong, we're very intersectional, okay? But we are still a marginalized community. Okay, continuing on. I have 2 children, Beth, who, when I sat in the Cleveland library that day, was 16, and Tim, who is 15. They are wonderful, loving children, the kind of people who, if I met them as strangers, I would want as friends. When they were young, I had tried to forget which was the adopted one. I did this not for the noble motive, but out of cowardice. Being a mother is hard. I knew from having watched my own being a child more difficult than many adults like to recall. And I sensed that the fact of adoption might make parenting more complicated and growing up more difficult for the adopted child. So first of all, I want to say, forgetting that your child is adopted is harmful to that child. We as adopted children have different needs than biological. That's not to say you shouldn't still give us love and acceptance and everything that we need, but in terms of hiding our adoption, not telling us where we're from, not having things about our culture and what our parents or our biological parents are like, is incredibly harmful. It should be, at least, considered neglectful to adoptive people. Okay, continuing on. I didn't want to worry about this, so I shoved it underneath nervously, and between the nervousness and the bearing, I hurt Beth. Okay, sorry guys. Not only did I get interrupted, I think I needed a moment to take a deep breath because I got angry with this author for having her biases. Alright, continuing on. How easily I see in retrospect I justified ignoring her adoptive status. I didn't want to raise an quote-unquote adopted child, just a child. I thought blithely when she was an infant, pretending that the fact of her adoption had no effect on Beth or me predisposed me to believe that it had no relevance to my work, even as I wrote the Good Housekeeping article and began researching my book. My interest in the subject of Georgia Tann was professional only. I had assured myself, even as part of me realized that my reaction to her was informed by my status as an adoptive parent. Regarding my research, I had attempted an impossible balance, getting close enough to relate the story with some empathy while staying far enough away to avoid intersection with it, and especially its protagonist. A futile gesture, as she could have told me. Now my personal life and research have collided, forcing me to accept who I was. Throughout my research, I had identified with Georgia's victimized birth parents rather than with her wealthy clients. But I too was an adoptive parent, profiting from the institution she popularized, profiting from another woman's misery, the loss of her child. At least she recognized it, finally. It was frightening to be so unmasked, and I had more than my own feelings to worry about. Having acknowledged George's connection to my family, I understood I would have to mention it in my book. How would that affect Beth? I pictured her smart, strong, popular, but with the vulnerability that even the most confident adoptees possess. Beth considered adoption a private matter, too private. I'd always felt, though I realized that believing she might become more comfortable with her adoptive status by talking about it for my book might be the ultimate justification. I didn't know how to broach the possibility with her. So I'm going to reiterate this for other people. When we're talking, if you're an adoptive parent or even a birth parent, okay, this goes for both of you guys, allow the adoptee to lead. So in this case, she was saying that Beth is pretty private about her adoptive status and her story. And I think that's fair. Allow Beth or any adoptee in this manner to be private. Allow them to bring it up when they're willing, if they are willing. It shouldn't be forced. And I want to make this clear whenever I talk about that I would like more adoptees to talk about this story. Don't think that I'm forcing it. You are welcome here. You are safe here. All of your feelings are valid here. They may not, again, you may not agree with me. I may not agree with you, but it's all valid. Okay? I, on the other hand, had a very different experience as an adoptee. I always knew I was adopted. I shouldn't say I was treated as an adoptee, but my adoptive parents were always open about everything. My mother allowed me to lead. If someone, she would always say, like, I remember this story when you were quite young and this lady looked at me and then looked at you and said, wow, your daughter really looks like you. And I was old enough to, talk at least. And I said, well, I'm adopted. And I don't look like my adoptive mom, by the way, and I hate when people say that. Not that my adoptive mom isn't beautiful in any way. It's just, I think because there's no genetic mirroring, and to be fair, I really don't, sorry, this is a little bit personal. I don't really see a lot of genetic mirroring in either of my biological parents either. At least not in my point of view. I know other people look more closely and see it in their stories, but not with me. However, my child looks like I cloned him, okay? To the T. very much that is what, we joke about. I was joking with my mom the other day, and I was like, are we sure that they didn't switch him at birth? And then I looked at him and I was like, no, they couldn't have. He looks just like me. And my child knew that I was joking, by the way. Like, we were just playing all around. I would never actually want that. But, it's just, my son gets to see that genetic mirroring between, going to his father's and seeing it a little bit with his siblings, and his dad and his, grandpa and his great-grandpa and all the family members that are around him that are biologically related, that live in our area. Whereas with me, in our household, he only sees it within me unless he looks at pictures of other family members, of my distant relatives, my birth parents, my birth side. So it's a little different, but my point still stands. Allow the adoptee to lead in terms of telling the story. And if Beth doesn't want to tell her story, it's okay. She doesn't have to. Anyway, continuing on. Feeling trapped inside my head, I shifted my gaze from the knothole on the table before me to the table beyond me, and further to the decorative scrollwork on chandeliers I loved. I took 10 minutes to get a drink of water, relishing every second spent, every step taken down curving stone stairways hollowed by other people's footsteps. Sitting back down, I retreated gratefully into my research, deciding to begin exploring Georgia's effect on adoption by considering the validity of her sales pitch. Adoptable children are blank slates. Several adoptees had told me how this statement had hurt them. It wasn't simply that they, like all children, entered the world with genes preordaining them to certain intelligence, personalities, appearances, and talents, but many adopted past infancy and occasionally at ages as advanced as 16, arrived in their new homes after having been immersed in a specific culture or, more significantly, traumatized by separation of their birth families. Not even the youngest of them was quote-unquote blank. Georgia, however, sent 6 and 7-year-olds with no musical ability to couples who, because of her falsification of their records, expected them to become concert pianists. She sent children of limited intelligence to college professors, intent upon sending them to Yale. Can you imagine those children trying to adjust to homes like that? Denny Glad had asked me. Can you imagine the frustration of those adoptive parents? Of course I couldn't, any more than I could ever know exactly how many children had been rejected and returned to Georgia, or had been placed in detention homes, or had run away. I had talked to adoptees dealt with these fates, and I'd read an article in the February 1933 issue of American Mercury magazine in which one wrote eloquently of her frustration. The danger that threatens an adopted child is not his uncertain heredity, his obscure background, or doubtfully legitimacy, but the fact that his adoptive parents take him ready-made and expect him to grow and evolve according to specifications which they set down as definitely as they select his sex or the color of his hair. When in any way he disappoints them, the trouble begins. This is exactly, I gotta say, still happens, right? Talked about rehoming a little bit with Natalia Grace. There is a Facebook group called Second Chance Adoptions where people literally rehome adoptees through Facebook, right? And talk about us like we're an animal to be rehomed. They talk about, it's like they're really kind of giving the same method that Georgia Tann did. It's really disgusting and disturbing. I wondered if Georgia's blank slate assertion still hurt adopted children. While it seemed unlikely that contemporary adoptive parents would believe her claim, most people hope their children will share their interests. It's unfair to expect this of their adopted or biological related children, but those raised by parents whose genes they share are more likely to resemble them in interests and talents. Adopted children have, of course, no genetic coding from their adoptive parents. I recall the surprise with which I watched Beth develop, and I am grateful she was so determined to do it her own way. But if she had been less assertive, would I have tried harder to mold her? When I adopted my own two children, the agency worker, this is a quote. When I adopted my own two children, the agency worker told me my nurturing would affect them 9 times more than their hereditary. Of child psychologists I spoke with for the project told me, knowledgeable as she was herself, she tried to believe the worker until her children taught her the truth. It was her clients that Georgia sought to serve. It is, and this is a half step forward, the needs of children and adoptive parents that adoption workers consider today. Birth parents remain the most neglected members of the adoption triad. Perhaps I shouldn't be surprised that it took me until the following day, Friday of that February week, to begin realizing how much Georgia had hurt them. Okay, pausing there for a moment. We're almost done with this chapter. In some ways, yes, birth parents are still very much neglected and don't get nearly as much studies or resources. But I also want to make it noted that I am an adoptee, focused first, centered first. And so I want to make it clear that birth parents were still had a voice. They still had the verbalization to speak up. Now, that's not to say that they weren't manipulated or, gone through things. Absolutely. Okay, I'm not negating that. However, as I've said in other chapters, there are some adoptees who cannot empathize with birth parents and don't understand why birth parents, especially birth moms, didn't fight harder for more resources. Then there's adoptees like myself who are able to take a step back and understand. But I also want to make it very clear that adoptees like myself had no choice in the matter. We had no say. We had no control. We had no option. Even those that were older, who may have had somewhat of an option, didn't really have that much of an option. It was this or that, and it's like grass is greener on the other side sort of situation, and it sucks, right? When we just want we want our biological parents, generally our biological parents, to be safer adults with better resources, right? Now, in foster care, yes, some to experience the unsafety and uncertainty with their biological parents, and so they may have a different point of view, and that's totally understandable. But again, it's very nuanced, right? All right, continuing on. Their babies were, she said, born innocent, blank slates. By virtue of their single or poor status, their parents, however, were tainted. According to Georgia and the theories of reformers, children raised by these tainted parents would quickly be tainted too. Single mothers who, before their children became marketable, would have been forced to raise them, were suddenly considered in contempt to keep them. This message was clearly conveyed by Georgia and her lawyer, Abe Walder. Writing to Georgia in 1937 about a mother who had sued to regain the baby Georgia had stolen, he boasted that his cross-examination had reduced the young woman to mincemeat. Her quote-unquote own counsel has indicated, he wrote, that I have convinced her of her own unworthiness. see, this is disgusting, but this is exactly how birth mothers are treated, right? It's just disgusting. The predictable corollary to this was that white, wealthy, infertile married couples felt entitled to the children. Let me read that again. White, wealthy, infertile married couples felt entitled to the children others bore out of wedlock. And that's very true today. It was as if single mothers bore children solely to fill childless couple needs. Illegitimacy, which had formerly been considered a nuisance, began to seem a societal blessing. When the children so born were white. Not until decades after George's death, would large numbers of white couples seek to adopt children of other races. But aided by promotional techniques, the most effective, which exploited the children's appearance, George's version of adoption, the placement of white children with white parents, grew popular. Okay, I'm going to make a quick break for that. So, yes, children adopt of other races. Mostly still because they, one, were cheaper, two, could still fulfill their quote-unquote fantasy of being a parent, but also kind of show like, hey, I'm not racist, hey, I'm not a bigot, but then go on and typically abuse the child. Now, there were times where we were at war, right? So we have an influx of children that were harmed by wars like World War II, Vietnam, and so forth, where the only way to bring them back, if a soldier had a child with another woman or with a woman overseas, that the child would come here and they would quote unquote adopt. That's a whole kind of complicated history. But a lot of children also came here due to war because it was unsafe where they were, which then the Hague Convention of Adoption started. That was after World War II, so I want to make that clear. But yes, there's a history of that. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, as George's influence extended outside Tennessee, the separation of babies from white single mothers quickly became institutionalized. There were 1,700 separation of babies from young single women in Minnesota in 1949. In 1925, when these babies had widely been seen as undesirable, there had been only 200. And while the later partings were, outside of Memphis, usually accomplished by methods less coercive than stealing, single mothers faced extreme pressure. One whose social worker refused her any choice communicated her frustration in a letter to President Truman in August of 1950. With tears in my eyes and sorrow in my heart, I am trying to defend the rights and privileges with which every citizen in the United States is supposed to enjoy under our Constitution. Just because I had a baby under such circumstances, the welfare agency had no right to condemn me and demand my child be placed. Exactly 10 years and 3 months earlier, a young single mother had poured out her own anguish regarding the seizure of her child by Georgia Tam. A letter written by Mary Owens to a social worker she futilely hoped would help her recover her child reads, quote, "Please help me to get my baby back. I am so heartbroken about the way it has been taken from me until I am about to have a nervous breakdown. After all, it was our own darling baby, and I would gladly lay down my life just to see her one more time. Miss Tan said she would always let me hear about her, but it's just like asking about the dead. Please help us, as it is even hard to try to live. And that is the end of chapter 8. And it ends with a small quote from investigator Robert Taylor. Her babies died like flies. So even the investigator knew that children that were in Georgia Tan's care really didn't last very long. Anyway, take a lot of self-care. That was a very heavy chapter. A lot to cover. A lot to delve into later in other videos. Just please practice self-care. Please, please, please. Anyway, much love to you all, and I'll see you tomorrow.